Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. We're going to kick off promptly as we have a lot to cover in the next 45 minutes. But before we get started, we've got a little bit of housekeeping. You're all on mute. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll aim to answer all your questions at the end of the webinar, and any we don't get to, we'll follow up individually. You'll also receive a recording of the webinar later today, and the slides will be available on request. So that's all from me, and I'm very happy to hand over to Alex and Joe for the remainder of the session.
Hello and good afternoon from London, or good morning or evening for those of you dialing in from elsewhere. We're delighted to see so many of you on today's webinar, Fake News or Real Progress, Assessing the Credibility of Climate Goals in the Automotive Sector. In today's discussion, we'll start by taking stock of the present moment, not just with regard to political developments in the US and beyond, but also to reflect on an issue of rising concern to financial institutions looking to generate sustained and sustainable returns on their capital, namely the credibility of corporate transition plans and how to distinguish between those that are aspirational and those that are truly robust. I'm Alex Clark, Research Director at Asset Impact, and today I'm very happy to be joined by Joe McCabe, the founder, president, and CEO of Auto Forecast Solutions, or AFS, which is a long-time partner of Asset Impact in delivering high-quality data on production in the automotive sector. Joe brings to the table over 30 years' knowledge and experience in building the sophisticated forecasts of vehicle production that we'll dive deeper into later on. And Joe's company also provides a range of data and advisory services to automotive suppliers, manufacturers, governments, financial institutions, and academic researchers. Target setting by companies has been all the rage for some years now, and anyone has set themselves climate targets of one kind or another on absolute emissions, share of energy from renewable sources, emissions intensities, and so on. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen some high-profile backtracking. Only recently, BP confirmed a $5 billion drop in low-carbon investment and a ramp-up of oil and gas production, which will now be 60% higher than its 2020 net zero plan anticipated. But this isn't a new phenomenon. A paper published in Nature Climate Change a few weeks ago makes clear that corporate targets, at least in the sample the authors examined, have historically only been achieved about 60% of the time. Just under 9% fail, but what's really interesting is that about 30% of targets simply disappear, perhaps in anticipation that they won't be met. In terms of the impact on emissions, this has serious consequences. In most years, the expected emissions reductions under abandoned targets exceeded those from achieved ones. So from a lender or investor's point of view, this raises the question of whether company targets can and should be trusted. If they can't, this poses a problem. How else can the credibility of transition plans be assessed? One way is to look to regulation as the minimum standard with which companies must comply to remain viable. So carbon-intensive sectors in the wealthier countries are under growing regulatory pressure to reach net zero, with the US federal government being the obvious, possibly temporary exception. A range of instruments have already been deployed, from carbon pricing and border adjustments to formal mandates, market-based incentives, and punitive fines. But this isn't to minimize the fact that efficient, better green technologies are increasingly competitive on their own merits. In the automotive sector, which is the subject of today's conversation, Norway, the UK, and Singapore are all expected to implement bans on greenhouse gas-intensive internal combustion engine cars, or ICEs, by 2030, while the EU, Canada, California, Japan, and China are considering various flavors of the same thing by the mid-2030s, often with severe consequences for non-compliance. But as we'll see, even regulatory benchmarking isn't quite enough to fully understand how realistic a company's targets are. For instance, last year we started to hear rumors that Volvo was considering backtracking on its 2021 commitment to sell only electric vehicles by 2030. So we dived into our data and found that although the projections got them close to the target, they still expected to be producing around 10% hybrids by 2030, with no realistic way of reaching the 100% target. And hey presto, in September, Volvo publicly announced that it would be abandoning the 2030 target and would still be selling hybrid models in 2030. The asset-based forecasts underpinned by data from Joe and his team turned out to be correct, with our data clearly indicating Volvo would be likely taking these steps well before it actually did so. Before we go into the data, here is a very brief overview of what an asset-based approach means for those with us today that are not already familiar with it. At Asset Impact, we source data on about 300,000 physical assets across 11 high-emitting sectors in the real economy, ranging from steel, aluminium, and power generation to shipping, aviation, and car manufacturing. We link each of these assets with production activity and associated emissions using our proprietary emissions models, and then we link each asset to its direct and indirect owners, all the way up the corporate ownership tree. This allows financial institutions such as banks and asset managers and asset owners to understand and monitor the underlying content of their lending or investment portfolios in an unprecedented level of detail. So financial institutions struggling with incomplete coverage, inconsistent reporting, and unreliable corporate targets can use our data to build a transparent and detailed assessment of the climate performance of the companies that they are exposed to. So let's dive in. First off, the auto industry is highly consolidated, and just 4 brand owners drive about a third of global production: Toyota, Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Hyundai. The top 20 brand owners, which are displayed here, make 85% of the world's cars today, with a similarly large share of Scope 3 carbon dioxide emissions. Most of the brand owners here are household names that you'll recognize, but they usually represent several different brands using the same underlying vehicle platforms for different variants. For instance, Toyota includes Lexus and Daihatsu, Volkswagen includes Porsche, Audi, Seat, and Skoda, Stellantis includes Chrysler, Citroën, Opel, Peugeot, and Fiat, among others, and Tata includes Jaguar and Land Rover. This concentration is a good and a bad thing. It means that electric vehicle production can ramp up quickly to 2030, as this chart based on AFS forecasts shows, but it also means less competitive pressure and greater dependence on a few major successes. Even Tesla, the great disruptor of the automotive market in at least a century, is barely in the top 5 producers, and it's the only fully electric one. So according to the projections, most new electric vehicles on the road in 2030 will be Volkswagens, Hondas, Renaults, Fords, Hyundais, Kias, and Nissans. But it's also clearly the case here that Tesla and the Chinese companies BYD and Geely have a massive head start in production volumes on their larger and potentially more unwieldy peers. It's perhaps unsurprising that the European manufacturers facing tough legislative constraints are also those planning to ramp up their production most: Volkswagen, Stellantis, BMW, Mercedes, and Renault, for instance. And we see that US, Korean, and Japanese manufacturers are much less prominent. Let's take a look at emissions. Based on today's production, weighted average Scope 3 emissions intensity among the 20 largest producers is about 150 grams of CO2 per kilometre. That's somewhere between a standard Volkswagen Golf and a mid-sized SUV, but is about 5 to 7 times an average hybrid. Our data shows average emissions intensities are expected to fall to about 110 grams per kilometre by 2030, but that's less than a 30% decline, which is alarmingly slow considering the range of ICE bans coming into effect in the coming years and the implication that ICE production will have to cease well before those bans come into effect. Under the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario pathway, which is considered the benchmark for industrial decarbonisation, only Tesla, BYD, and Geely were below the scenario 2022 global average last year. And by 2030, the panel on the right, the picture's even worse. Only Tesla, BYD, and just about BMW are within the scenario, and the fleet average is almost twice the scenario value. The 2 worst performers in 2030 among the 20 largest producers are General Motors, or GM, and Ford, and this isn't entirely attributable to Trump, as Joe will explain shortly. Japanese manufacturers Nissan and Toyota are also in the bottom 5. Looking more closely at the best and worst performers shows just how large the gap is and how it's bifurcated by home market, with GM and Ford tracking each other closely at the top there, Nissan and Toyota converging by 2030, just above the average in the middle, and Geely and BYD are the standout performers. And the remaining producers, which are not mapped on this graph, but are mostly European, are hovering around the average, which is the black dotted line in the middle. What the data tells us is that among the top 20 producers, only 12% of production today is battery electric vehicles, or BEVs. This share more than doubles by 2030, but it's still less than a third. and more than half of all cars produced in 2030 are still likely to contain internal combustion engines. If we look at ambition in EV growth as a share of total production, those with the loftiest ambitions include European manufacturers BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, and Stellantis, with BMW shown on the left here, perhaps driven by incoming regulation. And as we see here, in fact, BMW will be producing over 80% EVs and hybrids by 2030, according to projections. And among the least ambitious are Suzuki, Toyota, and General Motors, with Toyota in particular expanding its reliance on hybrids, but remaining largely focused on ICEs. And let's not forget that this really matters, since Toyota is the largest manufacturer in the world today by number of vehicles. So I'll hand over now to Joe to take us on a deeper dive and explain how his team's modeling approach and expertise can help us make sense of these trends. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. And thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm going to dovetail really nicely in all the stories Alex just provided. A lot of slides, a lot of content. So obviously we'll open up to some Q&A afterwards. Just a little background, we forecast every single vehicle built worldwide for the next decade. Who builds it, where, when, how many, powertrain detail. Been doing this for 30 years. In essence, our job is to tell a reality story. It's not just to say, hey, here's what government targets are, here's what policy says, here's what environmentalist groups are saying. We have to really focus in on the fact that all these companies we talk about are publicly traded companies. At the end of the day, they have one customer called a shareholder. So shareholder value is paramount. And consumers in the industry are sort of the means to an end. So when we dive into this data, we need to tell a more reality statement that really goes in for today's and future analysis. So what we do is we like to set a little ground work on this one, a little pre-COVID and a lot of post-COVID. So if we look at the higher watermarks of vehicle production in the past, 2016 and 2017 were the high watermarks globally. Significant production. There are currently 60 countries in the world that are producing light vehicles across 6 different regions. Excuse me about that. So obviously I have a dog. So the as if you look at today, the idea going forward is the only market that is expanding in that space is China. Somebody get that door. So I'm going to do a little focus on North America, and we are going to talk about the global, right? But what we do is when we look at the issues that are shaping the market, the issues going on the market is there's a lot of disruption, there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of risk. So to set the groundwork, I want to look at North America just for right now and say, in 2016, the most vehicle manufacturers ever built cars. That was 17.8 million units, but only 14 vehicle manufacturers got the job done. If we fast forward to today, 24 vehicle manufacturers are doing 2 million units less, and then that count goes up. Now, this is an issue that needs to be really addressed in this market, because when you talk about the automotive community, you talk about also the suppliers. And suppliers are this idea where I need more volume and more opportunity. But you have less volume and more players. That is a huge disruption in this market, especially as each one of these manufacturers is really trying to make their own mark in the industry. Now, another issue we are seeing, this is global, is this idea that manufacturers in the last 5-10 years have said we were going to invest heavily into BEVs and electrification strategies. They have not turned out as they expected. You're talking about billions of dollars, but it is a too big to fail proposition. So what's happening in that space is that what the manufacturers are saying, I have a vehicle program, and that vehicle program has a certain life cycle. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to extend the life cycle of that program. So instead of it being a 5-year of a Civic or an X Series or whatever it might be a 6 or 7-year program. And what that does is that pushes the next innovative product out. So just in North America in the last 12 months, 16 key vehicle programs got pushed out into the future. Every single month, we're seeing more and more of this happening. We're seeing manufacturers like Volkswagen say, hey, we're going to not even talk about at Audi. We're going to strip the e-tron name out. Mercedes was doing this also. We're going to strip out these nameplates that are dedicated EVs, and we're going to blend them into our normal nameplate nomenclature. We're seeing a lot of shifts. Now, again, this is not anti-electrification. It is just pro-reality. It is going to happen, but it's going to be very, very long over time. Now, there are 4 hurdles of any kind of adoption rate for electrification, and in this order: cost, range, infrastructure, and what we like to call the China effect. Number 1, electric vehicles are more expensive than their counterpart, whether they're a hybrid or whether they're a pure ICE vehicle. And that is still a significant problem for the consumers to get over that hurdle. Range, look, each vehicle is getting a little better. Most come in with 150 or 250 kilometers of range coming in as the base, which is really nice. But it's still in the psyche of the consumer about range is an issue. Infrastructure is always a problem. There's study after study that says there's not enough infrastructure, and when there is, up to a third of the plugs don't even work when you get there. And that China effect is one that's a blanketing everyone in the world. How do we remain competitive in our home markets while trying to stave off a potentially new threat of a high quality, low cost product while still making money in this? So lots of balancing act going on in this industry today that we're really focusing on nearly every 24 hours. So let's just set a baseline, and this dovetails into what Alex said earlier. About a third of all the vehicles, just shy of a third of all vehicles built globally through the end of the decade will be pure BEV. Now, there's also standard hybrids, which there's the Chevs, plug-in hybrids, which are the PHEVs, and extended range vehicles. Manufacturers are trying to get more creative. So when you look at North America, pickup trucks are where the money is at. But if you can find a pickup truck driver to buy a plug, you have done a Herculean task. That's going to be a very, very difficult consumer to move. So they're looking at things like hybridization and extended range options that basically sort of say, yeah, we're going to check a little bit about the electrification thing, but we can't check it all. If you look at North America, about same path, but heavily invested into standard hybrids in North America now and into the near future. Plug-in hybrids are starting to make impact. There was a theory 5 years ago where we should say, look, we should go from standard hybrids to pure BEVs because it's very expensive to make a plug-in hybrid. You got dueling technologies. You have a lot of things that are going into the cost structure. But again, you have to convince a consumer a plug is not a disruptor in their life, and that is going to be the biggest task. It's also going to mean that we need 40 million plug stations available for just this view that some may consider conservative, but we've been sort of on the reality path on this electrification adoption rate. If we look at Western Europe, different path, but Western Europe is very policy driven. It's death by 1,000 cuts for the consumer. It's, hey, if you want to be on the road at a certain amount of time, at a certain period of time, you have to have a BEV. If you want to be in the city centers at a certain time, you have to have a BEV. And the consumers are being sort of killed by death by 1,000 cuts in their wallet. What that's doing though is it's opening up new competition that's going to be low cost. The goal across Europe was, hey, let's push this electrification agenda. Let's push the consumer this direction. And by the way, you should be buying European brands. They're going, great. Now here come the Chinese. They're saying, we're going to come in with BYD, and that might be $10,000 less than its competition, going, well, if you're forcing me in this space, I'm going to look for something that's got high quality, checks all my boxes as a consumer, and is affordable. And this is where the real dilemma in Europe is happening right now, where there was a strategy in place to build an EV infrastructure and build European brands, which sort of backfired in terms of as the Chinese are entering the market. If you look at Eastern Europe, a smaller footprint, but that is where a lot of manufacturers are going to really try to really plant their flag. They're going to say, we want low cost labor. We want to build an economy in these places. And then we're going to build that and use that as our launching pad into more Western European technologies and countries. So this is a production landscape, heavy push into BEVs, obviously a lot less volume, but really the next frontier about where they're going to really make their investment strategies. And China. Look, China, we had this conversation in China about BEVs. China's goal is to be energy independent. They're sick and tired of buying everyone else's oil. They want to make their own dirty electricity with coal-fired plants. This is not an environmental push. This is a global dominance push. That is their ultimate goal of China, is to spread their manufacturing and footprint all over the world. There are still a significant amount of ICE vehicles that be built in China. So we sort of cap off, but again, 37% of a 30 million unit market is a lot of vehicles. So don't let that percentage fool you about how many BEVs that China is still building, governmentally pushed in that agenda. Now, if we look at just some highlights about BEV owners in the outlook, these are the top 5 in Europe. Volkswagen and Stellantis are still at the lead. However, we still put them in our risk category because they have way too many brands they're trying to satisfy right now. Right now, Stellantis is going through, they have to go through a rebirth. They have to really look at their brand strategy of 14 different brands and saying which ones should survive. I mean, let's take Chrysler as an example. Chrysler is the marquee pinpoint of the old Chrysler brand, part of Stellantis, and they make one vehicle, the Pacifica. So we got to really look at each one of these manufacturers. When you look at their global footprint and where they are now and going in the future, that's important. But really, what's their financial strategy? What should they do to really look about being competitive going into the future? We're seeing other things like Nissan having the same problem with their separating from Renault and then coming in and saying, now we got to find a new partner. So lots of moving parts going in. Now, from a new energy vehicle perspective, that is anything with a plug. That's a very important now identifier. Still, the leaderboard is there, but now you have new players like Mercedes that are hitting into that space. So that's a plug-in hybrid, extended range vehicle, fuel cell, very few of them, and BEVs. This is where governments are going to really say, okay, we're going to count these vehicles as zero emission vehicles to help us get us better to their carbon footprint. So we see this idea that policy will have to remain fluid to say, look, the consumer needs to consume the products they want. At the same time, we still want to put an environmental agenda behind the rationale of their buying decision. So this is where the really interesting balancing act occurs. Now, you got to look at who's coming, and it's the Chinese. BYD is looking for global dominance. They are planting their flag everywhere they can. They have entered into Europe. Their goal is to eventually the holy grail of North America. We have them coming through Mexico. Now, everyone's putting on massive tariffs on them. They're putting foreign entity of concern rules. They're putting in cybersecurity issues, everything they can. When it comes to a tariff is a BB gun against a tank with the Chinese. They're coming at a low-cost product anyway. You tariff them 200%. They don't care. What happened in the last 10 years is electrification became this idea of get market share first, profitability will come second. Ford was losing $100,000 per BEV last year. I mean, they don't even sell $100,000 BEVs, and they're losing that much money per BEV. Tesla's the only one making money. It took them 11 years to be profitable. However, BYD is profitable today. So they can walk into a market and buy that market. They can come in with a low-cost opportunity for a consumer at a high value. They can basically take the Korean model of saying, I'm going to listen to that consumer, and I'm going to say, what do they want? And I'm going to build what they want with a great warranty, great package, great technology, and I'm going to build a consumer. And people are going to forget that manufacturing is coming from China. Lots of people don't really know that Geely owns Volvo. They're Chinese owned. Yet they're still they look at it from their core of what their brand is. Chery is pushing it on an importer model all over the world. They're trying to South America approach. SAIC is all over the world and trying to plant their flag. And a lot of contract manufacturers need to pay attention to that are really going to hit this market and hit the market hard, because what they've been doing is they've been sort of borrowing, aka stealing Western technology for the last 3 decades, and now they're going to sell that back to us of vehicles that we want. Now, when we look at Tesla and others, why can Tesla pull this off? Well, Tesla is the only manufacturer ever in the history of automotive and going forward that can live on 9 unique nameplates all over the world. That's it. And as long as they can do 250,000 per year, even with their downturn of sales in Europe that just came in this last quarter, who cares? If they maintain 250,000 per year, they are a viable, profitable company. In the same time frame and a decade, they're going to have 802 competing vehicles, all trying for the same consumer and all averaging under 25,000 units per year, which is an unsustainable revenue model. Now, this is what keeps people up at night. The blue is the outlook of electrification. The green are their business plans, what they're trying to build, and they're telling the market because they want the investing community to jump on board. And the gray is the optimists that say, look, we're 7 years away from flying cars. And yes, there's all types of people out there. But even if the optimists are right, you still have at least 40% of the market that needs an internal combustion engine. Remember, hybrids still need an internal combustion engine. So the death of internal combustion engine to us is not going to be in our lifetime. It's here. They're just going to find different ways and different strategies on getting there. Now, we got to talk a little bit more about China, right? And we're going to talk about North America here. Everyone's so fearful of how the Chinese are coming. Over 7% of all vehicles sold in Mexico just last year were Chinese branded vehicles. Nearly 20% were imported vehicles from China, and that includes Kias and Buicks and Dodges and Fords and BMWs. So this idea of trying to keep China at bay has to be looked at a little critically. It's got to say, instead of keeping them at bay, how do we find a way to work with them because they're coming into our market, whether we let them in nicely or they come in as sort of adversarial relationship. So these are the things when we're looking at the analysis and saying, look, there's policies and there's governmental agendas and there's targets for him, but there's a reality statement we have to pay attention to. How can these publicly traded companies remain shareholder, get shareholder value, get profitability, and still maintain this really delicate balance of where their global environmental footprint needs to be. So just to sum things up, right? There are new consumers out there. Brand loyalty has eroded. There are people that are socially motivated. They watch TikTok, and we joke about it every single time. If I was an electric car company, I'd mock up 5 of them, give them to the 5 top TikTokers on the planet, and let them really and let them market it. I'll get 10 million eyeballs in 24 hours. If I get a fraction of that, I'm a car company. We say that tongue in cheek, but this is the new reality. People don't look at a brand and say, oh, it's been around for 100 years. I'm looking there first. They look at the today's shiny new object. We're seeing less trim variants, which basically saying, look, I'm a manufacturer. I'm not making any money on this babe. So instead of having 7 variants, I'm going to have 4 upscale. What that's doing is it's increasing the average price of a vehicle, which is making it very difficult for consumers to consume. And you got to look at a subscription-based model. This idea that over-the-air technology opens a revenue stream up for manufacturers. Say, when this car hits the used car market, I can still tap in this consumer because they're going to want monthly services. China, it's not if, it is when. We have to come to that reality statement, how they're going to play in the market. Everyone has to prepare themselves for the Chinese influence on their portfolio, whether they're going to work with them, like Stellantis working with Leapmotor, or where they're going to put up barriers. This is the reality. But the supply chain is really critical here. This idea of, if you're really focused on this idea of a better carbon footprint, then you got to get more vertical in your supply chain. Honda's putting $15 billion into Canada alone, saying we want to own it from the dirt and the mineral all the way to the final product. So this is where you're going to see a lot of adjusting of corporate strategy of the vehicle manufacturers, say, how do we control it and how do we protect ourselves? When COVID hit, everyone had a chip shortage. Everyone's running to Taiwan and had to get in line, right? Everyone's running to Chinese because they have the minerals, they have the batteries, and we're trying to change that mix. Okay, so when we look at the analysis that Alex is putting together and our team's putting together and saying, look, there's targets and there's reality, and we got to find where the healthy balance is in between. Final electrification, it's too big to fail. It is it is going to work. It's just going to take time, and it's going to take influence on everyone. We're going to have to see policies come back. We're going to have to dial them back. You can't be so handcuffing the consumer, the manufacturer, that you're penalizing them because the consumer is buying what they want to buy. You got to get these manufacturers to really focus on what they want and satisfy these environmental goals at the same time. Yes, Trump-era policy is a disruptor. Yes, tariffs are a major disruptor, but this is how this industry's always worked. There are always disruptors, and there's going to be manufacturers that are going to be proactive, and those are going to be reactive. And the reactive ones are going to have a really hard time sustaining their model going forward. Those getting ahead of it are going to be the ones that are going to win at the end of the day. Existing players know they can't do this alone. They can only do this with partnerships. GM and Ford and Volkswagen with Rivian and Honda building a Sony product. They realize they have to say, look, the only way we're going to do this and consume all this battery capacity is to work together today and then go off in the future and split and go our separate ways. You're going to see more and more consolidation. You're going to see more and more partnerships in the industry really trying to say, we have a common goal. We can't get there ourselves. But the reality is this: when new players hit a market, plans versus execution is very, very difficult. They may have very lofty plans, but it's a very expensive, very glacial speed market of automotive. We are talking about vehicles today that they're planning that won't be built for 3 years from today in this very volatile geopolitical, competitive landscape, pushing electrified agendas, lots of moving parts. So when manufacturers come into those regions, we got to say, who are they working with? Are they really understanding that market? If they're walking into Germany or Uzbekistan or China or Mexico, whatever it might be, do they understand the market conditions? Do they understand the policies they have to hit? And do they understand how to be competitive? And this is where we hope that, today, we hope it was useful for you today. I'm going to open up some questions where Alex and I can sort of address your key points. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you for the masterclass, the tour de force that you've just given on the landscape at the moment. For those who had difficulty accessing the webinar right at the beginning, we apologize for that, but we'll make sure that you receive a copy of the full recording afterwards, so please don't worry. And as Joe just referenced, we've got a few minutes for Q&A. So if you'd like to submit a question, please do so via the chat function, and we'll go through as many as we can. We already have a couple, so I think I'll start with a question to you, Joe, if that's okay. How are European and US manufacturers responding to the Chinese expansion into Western markets? And a follow-up question, given so many European and American manufacturers already make cars in China, is this even the right question to ask?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I mean, that's the big threat. You know, China, you need a partnership to walk into China today. They have to own you by 51% to even be a foreign manufacturer in China. That's how they've set it up 3 decades ago. In fact, Tesla's the only vehicle manufacturer that was allowed to walk into China with a partnership. So I think that's going to be a case study 10 years ago of why they were allowed in while no one else was. I think there's some underlying stories that's going to happen with the Tesla Chinese model. But yeah, so what we've done is they have learned exactly what we want as consumers and are basically selling back our technology to us at a lower cost. You know, when you look at China, China is the bank. The country is the bank for these vehicle manufacturers. Every other country, every other supplier in other countries have to worry about their own revenue footprint. You know, when a manufacturer goes to a supplier and says, I want you to build me a seat, well, that supplier has to say, great, I'm going to put in millions of dollars of tooling on my dime of a vehicle that you're telling me may build 150,000 units, when in reality it might be 50 because no one's consuming it. And that is a big problem for any Western Europe and any Western manufacturer, whether it's in Europe or North America, that's looking on the cost structure. China, the country, is the bank. So they are already coming in with a low-cost model, right? They're already subsidizing all the tooling for them. They're already helping with their R&D. They're already working with them, saying we're gonna make sure Chinese companies are successful all over the world. And that's not the same mark that every other player has. So yeah, everyone should be concerned about the Chinese. The idea is, how concerned, right? Do you work with them? Do you learn from them? Do you let them in? Do you mandate them to do a certain idea that they have to use local supply, local labor, and not just bring in Chinese labor to backfill their build? So it is the threat of the day. Unfortunately, that's a strong word, but it is the case, because all the manufacturers have built this idea that we need high cost products in order to survive and offset all of our electrification investment that hasn't taken off yet. And China can come in, like BYD, they can come in profitable. They're not building from zero and hoping they have a good product. They can come in profitable and actually reduce their price just to build market share. And on top of that, right, European manufacturers have sort of handcuffed themselves because of all the relationships they have in China. They can't just say, okay, we're going to tariff the heck out of you. They're scaling tariffs because they know that China, with a billion consumers, is still a huge part of their corporate strategy going forward. It's a very, very delicate balance on how China is going to influence the global market.
Thanks a lot, Joe. There's actually a second question which ties in quite nicely to that, and I think I'll add my own flavor to it as well, based on the observations we made on the asset impact data set built on your data. Where do you see the biggest gaps between company ambitions and the reality that you're seeing in your numbers, so stated ambitions? And if I may, one of the hypotheses that I floated in my own presentation was that we see the biggest level of ambition in EU-based manufacturers in terms of where they are today versus where they are going to be in 2030, according to current projections. How much do you think that has to do with regulatory constraints and the fact they won't be able to sell petrol, diesel cars after 2035, or probably well before that?
Yeah, I mean,
great. Or not?
Yeah, great question. I think that goalpost is going to get moved. right? This idea of saying a zero build strategy, these are targets. They've always been. GM, Mary Barra said 100% by 35, and even she dialed it back. I mean, there's a reality statement here. It keeps a pressure on them to say you got to keep innovating, you got to keep on looking at it. But the idea that we're going to have actually within the next even 10 years to say 100% build and sell, that is a difficult pill for me to swallow. I've been doing this for 3 decades, and rarely do governments and environmental agendas dictate the absolute poured concrete of what the market is. I mean, California's been trying it for years and they still can't get it, even though they are higher than everyone else in terms of adoption rates. You still have grid issues. You have a lot of moving parts here that aren't going to make sense. There are people that maybe in cities and, if you have small cars and all that, yeah, there's a good strategy there. But when you're talking about rural communities that maybe, they don't, that BEV doesn't satisfy their goal. It's funny, every time these conversations, everyone thinks it's anti-electrification, but not every product satisfies every single consumer. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense for any product in the world, let alone one powertrain strategy. So yes, Europe is pushing, but Europe can push a little harder because there's a smaller car strategy in Europe and they're a little easier to electrify. But when you talk about North America, forget it. Pickup truck buyers, large SUV buyers. But you're right. Europe is going to push harder in that. But I think what's going to do with the China impact is going to make these governments pull back going, yeah, but our intention was to push the manufacturing footprint at the same time. And that's not going in that direction. We are plant shutdowns, labor reductions are hitting. And the voters are going to push back and saying, look, I can't lose my job for the greater good of electrification.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions that are probably better for me to address, but just sticking with you for one more minute, Joe, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is from me. What do you think is the biggest uncontrollable uncertainty that the manufacturers are facing when it comes to things like the pace of electrification or the capacity of the grid to support a high level of penetration of electric vehicles? Are there manufacturers that are extending into kind of grid side markets to try and gain some control over that, which is also a factor related to government policy, etc.? What do you think is the biggest blind spot or unknown that's that really should be keeping the CEOs awake at night?
Yeah, I mean, blind spot's a good question. I mean, what we talk about, what keeps them up at night is the fact that they're diluted. They have to say, we have a successful ICE strategy. We have a potentially successful hybrid strategy. Now we got to put equal money into a BEV strategy that may or may not come to fruition. And when you spread yourself way too thin, if any one of those shows a crack, you're in financial trouble almost immediately. And again, we come back to the fact that these are publicly traded companies that require shareholder value. It's not a video game we're playing. Go ahead, could put a plan up there and see how it works. We have a highly integrated global supply chain that at any one time could have a problem. And they're all trying to say, how do we set ourselves up? When Russia went to the Ukraine, wiring harnesses were big for Volkswagen. It almost immediately hurt Volkswagen production because they were so focused on one region for one very specific product, because it offered that low-cost manual labor where they go, we have to learn from this and recalibrate. But recalibrating is not an overnight thing. It's months and years. So this idea, what they're doing is saying, okay, I got to find secondary and tertiary ways of protecting myself. But again, it spreads me too thin. So if more and more competition comes in and they show that new shiny object and that new consumer goes, I don't care, Volkswagen has been around for 100 years. I like this new thing's been around for 10 days because it's cool looking. And that's a reality. That is a very, very, very difficult proposition that keeps the CEOs up at night going, I got this chessboard, way too many moving parts right now. They don't have one or two. They have 15 and 20 moving parts. And any one of those could put their company basically in dire straits.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left. I'll just address a couple of the questions that have come through for Asset Impact, and then I'll just hand over to you if we've got time, Joe, for a final word before we close. But so the first question is how do you come up with emissions factors? So the way that our collaboration works is that we'll receive very detailed information from AFS that's broken down by manufacturing facility, and also every single model that's produced in that facility and the volumes at which it's produced both today and into the future. And in order to convert that into emissions, we'll match those with test cycle data at the model level wherever it's available. And generally speaking, our approach is to match as closely as possible. What that means is that when you combine the two, not only do you get an understanding of the production coming out of each facility, but also the scope 3 emissions associated with those vehicles once they're on the road. The emissions factors, or the average emissions factors that I showed you in the results presented a bit earlier, are the output of that when you average across all of the models that are produced in a given facility that is owned by a brand owner. And the single brand owner, as I mentioned at the start, can be making models under several different brands in potentially dozens of different manufacturing facilities across the globe. So the answer is that emissions factors are both an input and an output to our models. The second question is whether the approach to assessing credibility of climate plans in the automotive sector is applicable to other sectors that you cover. That's a good question. So in our data, we cover currently 11 real economy sectors, of which what we call light duty vehicles, which is automotive, is just one. And what our data is designed to do is consistently and with completeness in terms of the physical assets that drive activity and emissions attributable to companies, we are able to apply the same approach across all 11 sectors, which means that for some of the other sectors we cover, such as upstream oil and gas, power generation, steel, cement, again, as I referred to earlier, you're able to conduct an analysis that compares on a like-for-like basis the physical activities as well as the emissions and the emissions intensities on a physical basis of every company that's covered in our data set. And this can be particularly useful where you have companies that are active in multiple sectors as well, or multiple components of either the same value chain or different value chains. We're just about at time now, so just before we close, I'd like to invite you, Joe, to give us a sort of 30-second summary of maybe what you've said and what you think we should be looking out for in the coming years with auto manufacturing.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And look, to the audience, we've had a great relationship with Asset Impact over years. And what's good is that there's a reality statement behind this. We see a lot of organizations that will say, hey, here's the government policy, therefore let me calculate and get my roller out and say, hey, here's where we're be. And when you talk about a reality conversation, that's where you really got to be. And that's where our two companies really give you a reality to it. Yes, there's policy. Yes, there's direction. But you have to realize that markets don't necessarily follow that direction. It's going to be ebbs and flows the whole way. This market is, in 30 years, the last 5 have been insane in terms of volatility. We watch the news 24 hours a day, just looking for something new. It's going to say up, it's going to change a direction. Company has a new partnership, gets out of a partnership, kills a vehicle, whatever it might be. So lots and lots of volatility. So, the takeaway here is you got to stay on top of this vigilant, be vigilant. You got to say, what does this really mean? And really look through a critical, analytical, and realistic lens. We hope that we brought that to the audience today, and we continue to hopefully bring it to you going into the future. So I appreciate this time.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Joe, and thank you to everyone on today's webinar for joining us as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording will be with you in due course. So thanks for your time, everybody, and have a great afternoon or rest of your day. Goodbye.
Bye.